Western civilization is moving closer to a point of irreconcilable, unstable equilibrium, as frighteningly increasing numbers of people trust nothing. Media, academia, and especially the governments are no longer held in high esteem. Regaining trust is often impossible after betrayal. However, transparency is essential to any healing process, and that is the essence of the Don Sullivan Show. Please listen to the team explore, probe, and debate cutting-edge science, technology, and computing. Play ball! Welcome back to the Don Sullivan Show, everyone. The show where we discuss all things science, technology, and computing on a level that can be and should be absorbed and understood by your average American teenager. I'm your host, Don Sullivan, but allow me to once again introduce my partner, the now folk hero, Jersey Steve. Say hello, Steve.
Greetings from the Garden State, everyone. And we want to make sure we thank our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by License Fortress, the industry's first and only software asset management firm to offer both a financial and legal guarantee at its highest level of service. Whether it's Oracle, Microsoft, or VMware, License Fortress helps organizations stay compliant, avoid audits, and save money. Learn more at licensefortress.com. And please help support our producer, our wonderful producer, Bill Axt, by visiting axtinc.com. That is AXTINK.com. Subscribe to his YouTube channel and help support his efforts to create humorous animation as well as run our website, all while researching a cure for baldness. Back to you, Don.
Well, thanks, Steve. And at first, as always, and at the insistence of our lawyers, I need to read our obligatory disclaimer waiver, which simply says that all statements by the host and guests of the Don Sullivan Show are the personal opinions of the hosts and the aforementioned guests, who all agree that the following content is the property of Xanalytics LLC to be used publicly and exclusively on the Don Sullivan Show. And if everybody agrees, we will continue. And I know everybody agrees. All right, today, folks, we're going to deviate a little bit from our usual flippant and irreverence as we discuss the subject of deep salinity. Anoop Jalan is a dear friend of mine, a Silicon Valley professional who I worked with at VMware for more than a decade. Anoop has recently experienced a life tragedy, as we all do. Some of them come fast, some of them take a long time to drag out, but this is particularly acute and recent. He has because of that, some profound and amazing insights that he has suggested and offered to discuss with the Don Sullivan Show about grief and recovering from and managing grief. He has graciously and courageously, I think, offered to share those insights with the vast audience of the Don Sullivan Show. So, welcome, Anoop. Do I have all that right?
Yeah. Yep. Yes, you do, Don. It's been an interesting year. So.
It's been an interesting year, and again, thank you for appearing and talking with us and sharing these insights with us. And again, it's a subject that affects everyone on Earth, everyone's ever lived in different ways, forms, and fashions. And having it happen or experiencing something as you have with such an immediate impact in a way that is unexpected as well, and particularly excruciating, does give you a particular point of view that is really insightful, and somebody as thoughtful as you and as measured as you, I think is going to provide an enormous amount of insight. So we know that grief itself is a very complex emotion. Science of psychology categorizes 6 basic emotions: happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise. And putting aside the fact that sometimes contempt is included as a 7th, and sometimes contrarians don't even dispute psychology as being a science itself. I don't. But the focus of today's Don Sullivan Show is grief and that scientific subject of grief. And we're going to leave it in that vein. I think it's a reasonable premise that grief isn't just a complex emotion, but it's effectively the brutal side of all emotions combined. Anoop, given your recent life experiences, do you agree with that starting premise, or do you have any more to add to it?
I do agree to it to a large extent. Grief is a weird thing, and it'll hit you at the strangest times with the strangest things. I'll be okay for a couple of days, and I'll see or hear something completely random, and it sets you off. And it I don't know if the brutal side of all emotions is what I'd agree with, but it's definitely complementary in that sometimes that grief is tied with happiness, sometimes it's tied with sadness, sometimes it's tied with anger or fear or surprise or any of those things. But it's disruptive, that's for sure. It has definitely shaped my life over the past year. I will say the journey that it's put me on, I've learned a lot about myself, and I feel like I've learned a lot about grief. And I'm hoping that maybe something I've learned can help someone else, which is why I was excited to do this show with you.
Well, and I think of when I say the brutal side of all of them, happiness is hard to imagine as being brutal, but it has to be associated with that um, that brutal aspect of the memory. And um, I think of a particular moment of my own experiences, which is when you wake up in the morning. There's a second or maybe a few seconds that you don't remember, and then you do, and it just all comes flushing back to you. But there's that that moment of waking up that it's not the foremost thing in your head. Do you experience that?
I don't know that I've quite had that. Like I don't think I ever woke up and didn't remember that
Or it wasn't
my wife
it
wasn't
wasn't
around
the
anymore.
first thing on your mind, is what I'm saying. But go ahead. I'm
Right.
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah. I mean, there were times I woke up and I had a list of things in my head that I had to do, or something else was going on. Right. I do think when you think about those different emotions, what's helped me a lot, and I'm perfectly willing to admit that I'm in therapy. I think it's incredibly helpful. You break an arm, you go to see a doctor, you go through trauma. Might not be a bad idea to see a therapist. And one of the things that my therapist has been working on me with is being more specific when I name my emotions, right? Talk to somebody and say, I'm having a bad day. Okay, what does that mean? And it might be as simple as starting with one of those basic emotions, but eventually being able to pin it down more specifically helps you to be able to deal with that. But they all do stem out of that grief and the pain that grief brings. So yeah, I can see it being brutal, but I also think part of moving on is having it be less brutal as time goes on.
Someone once described the grief you go through having lost a loved one, sort of like almost in terms of a wave, where at first it's really overwhelming. The wave's larger, but over time, the peaks go further and further out, and they're not quite as much on top of you. I don't know if that's your experience. I don't know that that's a universal analogy, but to an extent, I think I found it somewhat accurate.
Yeah, I mean, there's that old saying that time heals all wounds, right? And time definitely helps, but I've seen other people who deal with grief, even in my family, who time maybe hasn't helped as much. But I imagine at some point it has to. Don talked about this is something that we all deal with, and that was something I struggled with early on. I'd wake up in the morning and look out the window and see people going on with their lives, and I was struggling with that. I I was in pain and I was suffering, and intellectually I knew everybody out there at some point has either dealt with or will deal with a significant loss. And I wondered how they could keep going, and I was struggling so much.
Yeah, and it's
And
interesting that you brought
It's
up
it's a yeah,
intellectually.
it's a survivor's guilt thing too as well, and I think at some point, and sometimes religions don't help us with this, but the further you get from it, you start feeling guilty about forgetting. And it's extremely counterproductive, obviously, and it's not rational, but it is something that has been ingrained in many of us in Western civilization in particular. It's hard to get past in that way.
Well, and there's the emotional there's the intellectual reality. Oh, I understand everybody goes through these types of things, but then there's the emotional reality, which is very raw, at least at first. That kind of takes over.
absolutely, and it's funny. I actually brought that up with my therapist, right? I talked to her and said, my brain understands a lot of these things. I've got to get my figurative heart to understand those things. And how do I make that happen? Like I can logically think through these things. And as an engineer, that's how I'm built, right? And but getting those two things in sync isn't always easy, and it takes work, it takes effort. At times it doesn't just happen.
Absolutely. And that is so true. You can't logic yourself out of everything. Not when not with a broken heart at the
Well,
end of the
in
day.
that regard,
Right.
you, Anoop, are an amazingly level-headed, even-tempered, thoughtful person. You're Midwestern. You're from Iowa. You just represent that manner and that sort of personality type perfectly. These are attributes, of course, that Stephen often elude those of us from the Northeast corridor. Um, but please go ahead and share with the audience some of the steps, if they are concrete, that, and you may even call them techniques, that have helped you manage this journey over, say, the last time period since this has occurred.
So the funny irony here, Don, is I was born in Manhattan. I spent the first 6 years of my life in New York City and then lived in New Jersey for the next 19, 20 years and then moved to the Midwest. Um, I don't know that my wife would have agreed with your assessment of me being level headed and even tempered and thoughtful, but that's neither here nor there. Um, I, you know, in terms of what I do, I think it probably has more to do with me being an engineer and some of the things that I saw when I was young, that I try and approach everything as logically as possible. And the thing that grief really did to me was it short circuited that for me, where I found that logic wasn't always humping like we talked about earlier. It made things much more difficult for me to process. There were things that I knew I wasn't being smart about, right? They tell you not to make any big decisions when you're dealing with grief, and I went and got a dog. Um,
Well,
so I
that's
didn't
a good decision. I don't know how big that is, but that's
it,
gonna be
it
great for
no
you.
it turned out not to be a great
Oh
decision. I
my God.
already had another one. Yeah, it was a mess. Maybe that's another episode at some point. Um, but yeah, I made some decisions that weren't so level headed, that weren't so even tempered, and I probably wasn't. But I think that the thing that I learned from that is that I kind of had to understood that that was going to happen, considering what I've been through. And I think having a support system of friends and family like you, who understood that I wasn't going to be myself for a little while because of what I was dealing with, and who were extremely gracious, and who told me I needed to be gracious with myself because that wasn't
Yeah,
easy to
I
do.
think that's
That helped
incredibly
a lot.
important point. And I'm gonna yeah, we're gonna discuss exactly that in a little bit here. And I think you couldn't have said it better, that you really have to give yourself a break, right? And
Yeah.
accept that. And it's so on. Yeah, I did not know that you had spent that much time in New Jersey. So it's kind of interesting because I know I'm a very intense individual, and I've subjected myself to significant emotional swings, mostly intentional, and brutal on myself for most of my life. Sometimes people ask me how I manage being angry, and I just tell them practice. Um, uh, and however, I've been monitoring my blood sugar in recent years, and it's amazing the quantitative correlation between the emotional state sometimes I have in blood sugar readings. So no RFK, it's not just the bread, but it is a lot of other things as well. I've always thought that allowing myself to naturally manage emotions is the best approach, but maybe not entirely. And especially given some severe diabetic conditions and so on. And I'm wondering, am I right about those correlations? How have you been dealing with some of the physiological attributes or physiological effects of your recent traumatic and grief situations?
I think that's an important statement that you made because I think it works both ways. I definitely had some physiological effects after my wife's passing. There were even just being lethargic, not wanting to do anything, finding it much harder to be motivated to do the things that I needed to do, even like to put together the funeral. I struggled with some of those things. And there's research out there, and I hate doing this because I hate people who say there's a study that says and don't actually cite the study, but I don't have the information on the study in front of me, so I can't cite it. But there's research out there that talks about how trauma, both in childhood and in adulthood, can have a physical effect on your health. It can manifest in your health. It can have effect on things like diabetes or high blood pressure or other things. Um, but I also think it works the other way around. I found when I could get active, when I could eat right, when I could do the things that I had to do to take care of myself and to encourage my son to do the same things, that also had it also helped me to manage those strong emotions, not necessarily manage them away because suppressing those emotions isn't healthy for you either, but managing them in a healthier way, in a way that was better for me, that was better for my son, that was better for those around me. Um, it it's a cycle that feeds on itself, right? That first step is the hardest, but you've got to take that first step for your sake and for the sake of the people who frankly are probably still counting on you. I had a number of people who were counting on me, and the way I thought about it, and this is probably the wrong way to think of it, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart. I
Yeah.
had to keep going for my sake and for the sake of those who were counting on
Well,
me.
they count on you both.
Then that can put pressure on you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, materially, emotionally, spiritually, other ways it's hard to define.
Yeah, all of the above. And it did put some pressure on me. And there were times where that was hard, but that pressure also kept me moving. It provided me the motivation that I needed. I had to think about if Heidi would have wanted me to stop and what that would have meant to Caleb, right? My son. I had to think about the other people who were counting on me, and it was what I needed for motivation. It may not work for everybody, right? Everybody's got to find their journey and their way out of this. Um, but finding a way to get yourself moving again, figuratively and literally, right? Exercise, eating well, some of the things that you've talked about in some of your previous podcasts about taking care of yourself help both physically and emotionally to help you cope with some of those things.
That makes a lot of sense. Two extremes I could pick would be on the one hand, just not doing anything and kind of existing in that state of grief and just trying to get through it, thinking, sitting around and stewing. Um, and then the other extreme, just throwing yourself into something completely and suppressing all that. But it sounds like there's certainly a happy middle ground where you're addressing your feelings and processing these things, but at the same time, you're also finding opportunities to maybe get out of your head and get out there and not just be stewing about it constantly. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, and that goes back to the waves that Don was talking about. I'd have a couple of busy days, and grief wasn't in the forefront, and something would happen, or I'd be less busy, or I'd see something, or I'd come across something, or I'd notice something on the wall, or something hanging
Those
in the closet, and
momentary memories can be brutal.
yeah, yep, yeah, those intrusive thoughts that'll hit you once in a while. They can be tough, and they can very quickly derail you.
Well, those are
And you just uh-huh.
those are two perfect. Both you and Steve Anoop have mentioned things that really segue into another interesting point here along these lines. That I have a motto, and it's don't get upset at yourself for being upset. In other words, don't create a vicious cycle of perpetuation of your own self immolation here. Um, don't drive yourself into a perpetuating vortex of depression because you're experiencing what's an entirely reasonable moment of distress. And you just mentioned exactly that you see something, whatever it might be, an episode of television that you laugh together with, or with me, a moment of sports or something along those lines that reminds you of something. Allow yourself to experience a total reasonable moment of sadness and allow it to work itself out naturally. Does that make sense?
It does, but I also think it goes beyond that moment of sadness. I think it goes to how you manage the grief and how you manage what's going on around you. And this is where a number of people I'd feel bad about not doing certain things I was supposed to do. Like after the funeral, I got a stack of thank you cards from the funeral home that I was supposed to fill out, and I couldn't do it. And it's 6 months later, and I went to somebody and I said, should I start filling these out, because I don't feel like I can. And that person said, then don't worry about it. Like, no one's going to be mad at you about not filling out a thank you card for coming to the funeral. And if they are, who cares?
Yeah,
And being able to give yourself some of that grace helps a lot. And it probably seems like a silly thing, but it makes a big deal. I mean, the other side of it is, I can't tell you how many times I got a phone call or a text from someone at just the right time, and it got me through it. But the other side of it was, I had a number of people who called me a couple months later who said, I didn't want to bother you. And what I'd say is, if you have someone who's close to you who's dealing with grief, don't let that stop you. You can ignore a text, you can delete a text, you can silence your phone. What you can't do is force someone to call you.
that's a unbelievably great point because what they're doing, what you will be doing in sometime in the future with somebody else, maybe me, maybe Stephen, is is continuing life, living the next day and living the next moment, and obviously not ignoring the situation that you're in, but helping somebody get through that next moment. And that's why what you're saying to people, everybody who's listening, is don't hesitate, don't be afraid to reach out and be normal, at least for whatever time you can, especially if there's something really relevant in life. You have a job, you had things to do. You gotta you have to live in that moment and determine what's next and be in that. So I think you really brought up an incredibly good point there.
Yeah, I learned I learned a lot about managing my grief, but I also learned a lot about how I want to help others when they're dealing
Yeah,
with it.
that's great.
It's a silly little thing, right? But I had, well, and I
Not
was
insignificant.
another specific example, right? I had someone drop off a meal and they left a card, and they specifically said in the card, "Don't have to send us a thank you. All the everything that we gave you is disposable. Don't worry about getting us anything back. Don't like those little things that would stress me out.
Yeah,
I didn't have to worry about,
yeah, that's
right?
great
And it may
advice.
seem
Yeah.
minor, it may seem, yeah, but like it took such a weight off of me.
Well, and that
It's
was a
making your
product,
life a
yeah.
little
And
easier.
that was a product of
Yeah.
the other person being very thoughtful and really
Yeah.
putting effort into what was necessary to help you. And everybody listening and the three of us on this call need to remember that when we're in that opposite situation as well. What can we really do to make things better in that moment? That's a great point. And let me shift a little bit here to, we mentioned research before, and I want to bring up the most renowned researcher in this field, Dr. Elizabeth Kupler Ross, who has since passed herself. But I mean, remember studying her in a religion class in high school, and she defined 5 stages of death, sometimes referred to also as the 5 stages of grief. Do you think, and this is really interesting given your situation now, do you think all of those steps, at least as you, I'm sure, have heard about them and understand them, are necessary, or can they be circumvented? Have you experienced them yourself, do you think, or have you taken some time to think about that?
I know I have. And I continue to experience them. As like I said, as an engineer, you kind of think that they go in a specific order, and then you get through one and move on to the next one, and it doesn't work that way, is what I'm learning. As a minor tangent, I've always been a big Simpsons fan, and there's an episode where Homer is sure he's dying, and he very quickly flies through the 5 stages. If anybody's seen the episode, you probably remember what I'm talking about.
I was
Um,
thinking of that actually when Don brought it up. My mind went there too.
yeah, so hopefully someone else gets it, but I. It's interesting. That's been a big topic of conversation with my therapist, and understanding, sometimes even just naming that I'm going through this particular stage of grief, and understanding that it's going to happen. It's natural. It's not, those aren't the only pieces that you deal
Well,
with,
they weren't
right?
meant to
There's a
be
lot more
serial
to
either.
it.
They were meant to
Right,
be
right.
exactly as she said. It's stages that can be go back and forth between them and so on. But I'm sorry I interrupted you, but that was it.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and I think people get confused, right? We think of the 5 stages of grief, and I almost thought about it like a system, and I think this is something we were going to talk about later, but I'll just bring it up, right? I I optimize systems, right? How do I get through these 5 stages as quickly as possible so I can move on with my life? And it doesn't work that way. Like it just doesn't. Like, you can try, it's not going to happen.
Well,
There's no
you're
express lane. Yeah.
yeah, you can't manage them. That's kind of what we're going to ask and talk about here. You really can't manage them in any overt or even overly simplistic innate way. They kind of hit you at different times, and you deal with them as it comes. You think that's true?
Oh yeah, I because that's what I've experienced, and I find myself getting mad at myself that I couldn't, that there were stages of the stages where I was struggling more, and I couldn't get done everything I wanted to or needed to. And why couldn't I get through these stages faster? And I was trying to find ways to get through them faster, and then I do what I thought was going backwards. I'd go from one stage to another and then go back to the previous one, and I get mad at myself for slipping backwards. And that was something that my therapist has helped me a lot with, that understanding that these are are things that are likely to continue for a while, and I'm going to go between them. The one that I found most interesting, that I'm starting to learn more about, is bargaining. Right, a lot of times we think of that as, some sort of take me instead, but a lot of times bargaining can also be, man, I wish I'd have been a better husband, or what could I have done differently, or what should I how should I have handled myself afterward differently, right? Those things that we want to go back and change are actually forms of bargaining, and it's natural to think those things through, but again, we've got to be able to let ourselves off the hook for what happened in the
Don't
past
get mad at yourself for
and
being mad at
continue to
yourself.
move
Yep,
forward.
I
Yeah.
totally agree. It's a and you put it in the form of grace, and you have to accept the fact that you're going to be in these particular mindsets for some period of time, whatever that might be. And the more you can, the better you'll handle it. And that's just a wonderful way to look at it. And I
And I think oops,
no,
sorry.
no, go ahead. You
I, I,
because
I think Steve nailed it. I don't remember the exact person, but there was someone who did a TED talk, and she talked about, you don't get over grief. You continue to move through it, and it becomes part of your life. And at some point you have to be able to embrace it and ideally use it to make yourself better for those around you.
yeah, yeah, I I think that's another wonderful and very important sentiment and lesson for everyone. Again, everyone listening and us three as well. Now, let me sort of shift here to something that might seem trite, but I don't think it is. To me, and I think most Americans, whether they know it or not, sports is always instructive. And just giving an example here that I know we've talked about before. I remember a basketball announcer many years ago, and there's uh, a HBO Max series about the Celtics right now. So if you want to go look at it, you can find it. But there's a basketball announcer that during a quintessential Larry Bird clutch moment, he was about ready to shoot a critical foul shot, and the announcer explained that even the greatest foul shooters in history are only 90% at their best, meaning they miss 10%, and that courage is about putting your fear aside and doing your job. Now, of course, Larry Bird, no surprise, hit the foul shot. But I also think that grief provides us with a similar opportunity to set aside or at least deal with our understandable fear and anger and take on that day, whatever it brings. Is that a fair metaphor, if you will, or an analogy, even?
I think it is. I think that we have to think about that clearly, though. Especially the first couple of months, I had a lot of help. Like, one of the things that I felt most responsible for was my job. Right, that's how I provide for myself and my son, and help some other people, and do a lot of things. And I was there was a lot of fear about what's going to happen. Like, I'm falling apart here. How do I do my job? Right? How do I take care of the things that I have to take care of? What I had was, I had a great support system, even within those who I worked with, who understood that, you know what, I could call them and say, I need today. I need a day. I need to take today off. I'm not in a good space. I can't go talk to customers. I can't, like, I shouldn't be talking to
Yeah,
customers. I shouldn't.
right. You shouldn't
And
be.
they would give me that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you're not wrong either. Like, it's very easy to slip into, yeah, today's not as bad as yesterday, but I'm just not going to do anything. At least for me, I needed to stay motivated. I needed to keep moving forward. I needed to be busy to help deal with what I was doing. And so, dealing with that fear and that anger and that grief, and recognizing it for what it was, and naming it, and being able to manage it and think it through, to a certain extent, embrace it, but not let it control me, was important to me.
You know, um, I've always thought that, and you just brought this up in the TED Talk, because it's sort of perfect in regards to our theme here, that you never, and I'll again quote the TED Talk sort of coincidentally, you never get over it, but sometimes you can consider yourself getting past it, and it becomes part of you. It becomes innate to you. You become a more evolved version of you. Do you think that's true? In other words, everyone can get to a point in which they're ready to experience and embrace what's next, which is what we're talking about, and make the most out of it each day, but it is still just a part of you. You know, do you think that's true? Do you think you're going to get to that point?
It it is, and that person's always going to be a part of you, right? They
Yes,
they leave an indelible mark on you and who you are as a person. And I think that's where, I've used the word grace a few times because I don't know that I have a better word in my vocabulary to
it's a great
describe it.
word and it's
But I
perfect. Yeah,
but I think you have to have the grace to let yourself do that. I've had a number of friends come to me and understandably, yes, it's a massive loss, but at some point, if there's someone who you care about, they cared about you, and they wouldn't want you to be unhappy forever, which goes without saying. So at some point, you have to be willing to embrace what's my life going to look like going forward, whatever that is. And I think I'm starting to get there. I'm starting to see a light at the end of the tunnel. And it has been the support system that I have around me that's helped, whether it be professional help, whether it be friends, whether it be family, whether it be whoever, right? The one thing I've learned is people are willing to help, even the people who you least expect. People are want to help. And when you look at the world around, sometimes that's hard to see. People care, right? And when they see someone else in pain, I think at the end of the day, most people want to help, especially when it's a pain that they understand. And I think a lot of people already understand loss, or they will soon. And
and we
so
talked
I,
at
I
that right at the
think being
beginning.
able to, yeah,
Everybody has
yeah,
experienced it on one level or another in different ways, and maybe not as acute as you have it right now, and maybe not as tragic even, but in some way they do. It's just there's very few things that people can relate to, and without again even touching on any world politics and so on, there's nothing that brings people together more than winning, and there's nothing that brings people together or that they understand in common more than grief, because they all have it.
though I'd say that sometimes grief will make you isolate yourself, and you can't do that.
No, you
Yeah, that's a
can't.
great point.
You can't, because and you shouldn't, because as we're discussing here, and as you just mentioned, you looked outside the window and you knew everyone had experienced it. And I said at the beginning, everyone has. I just did, and we have to accept that. And even if it's awful right now for you, for anybody, I have a feeling that I might be experiencing something in the relatively near future in a different way, but everyone does on some level understand it and has experienced it. It's part of life. And it has to be. So, I don't mean to drone on about that, but it is, um, it's something that is so important to our common experience in humanity. So, um, let me sort of again digress, just slightly. I mean, there are, again, as I said, a few things that we do have in common. Grief is among them, but it comes in these different forms, and sort of transitioning, but staying on the same theme. Would you say, because this is something that I have said, do you think that in that sense it makes us more human?
I think in some ways it gives us the opportunity to be more human. people deal with grief in different ways, and ideally we would all deal with it in healthy ways, and some people do use grief to make themselves better. Unfortunately, some people don't for whatever reason. And I think it gives us the opportunity to be more human and more understanding and more caring. I find myself more likely, if someone cuts me off in traffic, to think about what's going on in their life that they just didn't think about
You have a
that.
better understanding of
Right.
the bigger picture as opposed to
Right.
that momentary anger that you might viscerally just let out, that you can expand yourself to be empathetic towards them even though you don't have any idea who that person is.
Right.
Yeah.
This is
Because
very
I've
New Jersey centric, this topic right now, talking about road rage.
Well,
right, right,
of course. That's what we do, Stephen. But yeah, and
right.
apparently you too, Anoop. I didn't know that. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
if you would,
I do my best to hide it, but it's in there.
yeah. Oh my gosh, that's so true. Well, what advice do you have, if you have any at this point, for somebody who has a sudden experience or somebody who, and again, it's the same thing in common base, but in different forms. But for somebody who has a sudden tragic experience or an experience that they have, obviously dragged out and they have to deal with.
We've talked through a lot of them. I think the first one is just that, about giving yourself some grace and understanding that you're dealing with something that is horrible, right? Um, on a more practical point, people don't like thinking about loss like this. Make a plan. Like I think about some of the decisions that I had to make. I don't want my son having to make those decisions about me. I am going to lay everything out for him. So I'm gonna make it as easy as possible for him. It just, don't lose your support system. Let other people help you, right? And understand that when they do that, look, let's be honest, people are going to say and do dumb things, but they do it because they care, right? Understand where it's coming from. Give yourself a chance to be mad and move on. But I think probably the most important thing, and I probably waited too long to do this, is don't be afraid to get help. I think our generation isn't great about that. There was a stigma about going to see a therapist or going to get help or going, and I think we have to let that go. That I think people younger than us, some of the generations behind us, are much better about that. And those people helped me so much, and I was shocked at how much more they knew about mental health than I did. It's been transformative for me.
I think that's incredibly good advice. And Anoop, I hope you're able to come on the Don Sullivan Show and talk about other subjects that you are expert in your life, both personal and professional. As we move on with the show, and but I do want to know what's next for you on a personal level. I mean, obviously, professionally, we're all working our way through Silicon Valley mess with the present state of the world economy and the economic war and so on. So, that is going to work itself out as time. But what personally is next for you?
For me, I think it's about finding contentment.
Say
I
that.
mean, my life,
What does that mean?
finding contentment.
What does that mean?
So to me, it means there's going to be good days and there's going to be bad days. And I'd like to be, you know, I think we talk a lot about finding happiness, and that's definitely a goal. And there's things that I want to be able to do that, there were things that when you're in a marriage, you compromise. There's things you do, there's things you don't do because maybe your partner's not interested, right? I'm looking forward to finding out more about who I am as my own person, as an individual, finding out the things that make me happy, but also understanding that this grief is going to be with me for a long time. And so can happiness potentially. It doesn't mean I'm going to be a happy person all the time, but hopefully that median is a good enough. And that's what I mean by contentment. I'm okay with where I am and who I am and with what's going on around me.
Well, Anoop, you're an amazing guy, and I am privileged to have known you for as long as I have, and our both our professional interactions and those that have deviated off into the personal. We live in different states, but apparently we came from the same state, which you're very different than me in that regard, which is kind of amazing. And
He got out early enough,
yeah, I
Don.
think that's the case. I think you got out
I,
early
I
enough to
don't
be
know, but
offended.
here's the deal, Don. I appreciate the praise, but it does make me question your judgment.
Yeah, okay, I understand that. That's true for a lot of people, including Stephen here. But I cannot thank you enough for having the courage again to discuss this subject for 45 minutes on what is a public and show with a vast audience of the Don Sullivan Show, and I can't thank you enough, and the audience thanks you enough, even though they can't respond, and we'll see what the comments are like that come through. So again, thank you so much for being on with us. And Stephen, you got anything else to add?
No, this was wonderful, very insightful. Thanks, Anoop.
Thank you.
And
Thank you both.
okay, and folks, I want to thank you all, everyone in the audience, for listening. Please tune in, download again. There'll be many more shows. And folks, remember, and I can't think of a more appropriate time to sign off the way we sign off on the Don Sullivan Show, because this is the perfect moment to say it. All at bats are situational. Remember that, and it doesn't get more appropriate than right now. So thank you, everyone.